Welcome to 502 Conversations. I'm Brian Kirby. My guest today is Dr. Paul Offit. Thank you for coming, Dr. Paul Offit.
Thank you.
Should I call you Dr. Offit, Dr. Paul?
Paul's good.
Oh, okay, right. Now, I have a bio on you, and I'm going to read it. I know a lot of it, but I want to read it because I want to establish your credentials and authority,
Okay.
if you don't mind. It's kind of long, so I apologize, but this is important, I think. So you are Professor of Pediatrics in the Division of Infectious Diseases, and you are the Director of the Vaccine Education Center at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, as well as the Maurice R. Hillman Professor of Vaccinology and Professor of Pediatrics at the, is it Perelman School?
Perelman.
Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. You have been a member of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. You're a board member of Every Child by Two, and you are a founding member of the Autism Science Foundation. In April of 2018, you were awarded the Albert B. Sabin Gold Medal. Given annually, the Sabin Gold Medal recognizes those who have made extraordinary contributions in the field of vaccinology. You are an expert on vaccines, immunology, and virology. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And the co-inventor of RotoTeq, a rotavirus vaccine that is credited with saving hundreds of lives every day. You have appeared on the Colbert Report, CBS This Morning, The Daily Show with John Stewart, 60 Minutes, Inside Edition, the PBS Newshour with Jim Lehrer, and Democracy Now!, among others. And you are the author of hundreds of publications and several books, 10 books, is that correct? Mm-hmm. Including Bad Faith, When Religious Belief Undermines Modern Medicine, Do You Believe in Magic, The Sense and Nonsense of Alternative Medicine, Pandora's Lab, 7 Stories of Science Gone Wrong, several books on vaccines, and your latest book is Bad Advice, or Why Celebrities, Politicians, and Activists Aren't Your Best Source of Health Information. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay, well, thank you very much for coming today, and I will dispense with the bio. Now, I didn't actually want to talk about vaccines, because you talk about that a lot, right? Do you ever get burned out about that, or?
No.
Okay, you don't. All right. So something came up recently that I want to talk. There are actually a few things. First thing, let's deal with exactly right now. Measles. It's 2018. How are we doing?
Well, we eliminated measles from the United States by the year 2000. We'll start at the beginning. We had our first measles vaccine was in 1963. Prior to that, we'd have 3 to 4 million cases a year, 48,000 hospitalizations a year, 500 deaths a year from measles. Measles vaccine comes in 1963. By 2000, we had eliminated measles from the United States. Done. But because enough parents now are choosing not to vaccinate their children, measles is coming back. So we're still having outbreaks of measles in the United States, which when you think about it is unconscionable considering we don't have to suffer measles anymore.
And it's 2018. What are the statistics? So last year, when there was a peak around 2015, right, with the Disney World outbreak?
So 2014, 2015, there was an outbreak that started in Southern California Disneyland. And
then spread in the hundreds, right?
Right, so it spread to 25 states, involved 189 people. Right,
okay.
Mostly children.
And in 2018, I think just a couple of months ago, I read this bizarre story I don't know if you're familiar with this or not, but this bizarre story about a nurse in Texas, and they had a patient who had measles. And I think a picture leaked out. I had no idea, but this disease is, if you get it bad enough, it's terrible. This kid looked, unrecognizable. And this nurse posted this weird thing, like if she had a choice, she would take a swab and go home and give it to her own kids. Can you comment on that? Or
well, it cost her job. First of all, it was a HIPAA violation. You can't put patient information on the internet the way she did it. But it was the other thing that was most interesting to me actually about that story was that she was surprised by how bad it was. I mean, this is what measles was. I am a child of the 50s and 60s. I had measles.
You did? Okay.
Sure. I mean, I had measles, I had mumps, I had German measles, I had chickenpox. That's what happens when you're born before 1957. You had those diseases. So I remember measles. I mean, if you look at people with measles, about 50% of them will have abnormal chest x-rays. They won't all have clinical pneumonia, but half will have abnormal chest x-rays. Measles makes you sick. I mean, when she was surprised by that, what that tells you is not only have we largely eliminated measles from this country, we've eliminated the memory of measles. People don't know how bad that disease was. I think that's why they're so cavalier about choosing not to get the vaccine.
So she got fired for a HIPAA violation, or did she get fired because she said, I would take this home and give it? She's anti-vaccination.
Yeah, she's anti-vaccination. Somehow she believes wrongly, that it's better to be naturally infected than immunized. Now you could argue, if you take a step back, you could argue if you're naturally infected with measles, as I was, you probably have a greater frequency of immune cells, so-called memory B and T cells in your body, than if you're immunized. That's true. You also have a higher antibody response. But the issue is not whether or not natural infection is better than immunization. It's whether immunization is good enough. I mean, immunization essentially gives you the immunity you need to protect you against disease without having you pay the price of disease. I mean, I'd had to pay the price of measles, but children today don't have to pay the price of measles, but they can get immunity that's good enough to eliminate the disease from the country.
So is there a natural infection that doesn't get as bad as this child has it? Are there various levels of are there various levels of measles? Because I think when I was a child, I heard, oh, you're better off getting chickenpox when you're young, and if you get it in your teens, it's going to be worse, and if you get it when you're 20, it's worse. And this woman just sounded, I don't mean to cast aspersions, but she saw what was happening in the hospital. She said she would take it and give it to her own children. It was very bizarre.
Go ahead, cast aspersions,
Well,
not a problem. I mean, the notion that she would even consider infecting someone with wild-type measles virus, i.e. natural measles virus, knowing that measles killed 500 children primarily every year in this country before there was a vaccine, is just criminal. It's remarkable to me. And you're right, though, that both measles and chickenpox tend to be more severe when it affects adults, including older adults. You're more likely to get pneumonia, more likely to be hospitalized. But, you know, it's never good. I mean, before there was a chickenpox vaccine, which was much later, that came in 1995, every year there'd be 10,000 children who were admitted to the hospital with chickenpox and 100 who died, most of whom were previously healthy.
People died from chickenpox.
People died from chickenpox, exactly right. I've seen chickenpox deaths.
Wow. I had it. I just never, you know, when I was a kid, I guess it must have been rare enough that you died that was just one of those childhood diseases.
Well, so everybody got it. I mean,
right, yeah, we all got it.
And 100 died. So you're right. I mean, when you consider a birth cohort of around 3 million people, it is uncommon, but it wasn't unheard of.
I didn't follow the story too closely, but I was trying to hope beyond hope that maybe she had small children and she was going to try and give them like a small dose of her. I just couldn't figure.
There's no such thing as a small dose. It amplifies. The virus amplifies itself. It'll replicate hundreds of thousands of times and can ultimately kill you if you're unlucky. Remember, there's not a specific antiviral medicine for measles. It's just supportive therapy. When people have, we had an outbreak of measles in Philadelphia in 1991. That in one city in one 3-month period, we had 1,400 cases of measles and 9 deaths. I mean, I lived through that epidemic, even though this was 30 years in the development of the measles vaccine. Most of those parents had chosen not to vaccinate their children. It's centered on 2 fundamentalist churches in the city, and so. That was hard to watch, but there's no such thing as a small dose of measles, no such thing as a little measles.
Okay, well, I'm just trying to figure out what this woman was thinking. I mean, she is a nurse. She must have gone through 5 years. I don't know if she's an RN or not, but they're educated beyond.
Or schooled.
They have education, medical education. So the shocking thing was also in some of the comments, if you followed it, people were saying you'd be surprised how many nurses are anti-vaccination.
It's true. It's true.
And you work in Children's Hospital. Is it the same in a Children's Hospital?
Yeah, I'd like to think in our hospital, Children's Hospital Philadelphia,
okay,
that's not an issue. But I think nurses tend to take a position of sympathy with their patients, and so there are certainly a number of patients who are anti-vaccine, and sometimes nurses will take up that cause. It's true.
All right, I want to read one letter to an editor that was recently posted in my local paper, and perhaps you can comment on this too. This is the Harpswell Anchor. I'm going to take a picture of us with this. Harpswell Anchor from September, and I printed the letter out. It is in here, but do you mind if I read this to you?
Please.
Okay. Letter to the editor. Vaccination required, ? My son started school last year in Woolwich. There was a message in one of the school's newsletters. Quote, effective for the 2017-2018 school year, all students entering into 7th grade will need to receive 1 dose of Tdap vaccine before attendance is allowed, in all caps was in the original letter. Please provide the nurse a copy of this immunization, signed Nurse Sherwood. My son will not be entering 7th grade for a while. Back to the author. Maine requires vaccines for school-age children, and I remember watching children cry at Harpswell Community School during a mandatory vaccination for avian flu, which turned out to be a fraud. Why? ? What just a few of many doctors have said. Quote, parents, people, please get it that no vaccines prevent diseases. Orthodox immunological research since the beginning of the 20th century has been demonstrating that vaccines sensitize, and then it ends in an ellipse, so I don't know. And that's quoted by Dr. Vera Scheibner, PhD. who I think is a geologist. Second quote, vaccines are the backbones of the entire pharmaceutical industry. The vaccinated children become customers for life, end quote, Dr. Sherry Tenpenny. Quote, there is a great deal of evidence to prove that immunization of children does more harm than good. There is no evidence that any influenza vaccine thus far developed is effective in preventing or mitigating any attack of influenza. Dr. Anthony Morris, former Chief Vaccine Control Officer and Research Virologist, US FDA. And the author ends with, good documentary to watch, Vaccination, The Hidden Truth. And his last sentence is, multiple vaccine doses have resulted in 145,000 child deaths in the past 20 years. Let's have a conversation for our children's sake, period. I will not read the author's name. So, care to comment on that?
Well, it's just a series of statements that are incorrect. So the influenza vaccine, while it's an imperfect vaccine, last year the efficacy was around 40%, which is say 40% of people who got that vaccine were protected from getting moderate to severe influenza infection. So when you look at the numbers, I mean, influenza virus obviously kills more people than all other infectious diseases, vaccine-preventable diseases combined. So when you had last year, you had 80,000 deaths, and you had, millions of people who were infected. A 40% efficacy rate is going to prevent millions of cases. It's going to prevent tens of thousands of hospitalizations, and it's going to prevent thousands of deaths. The CDC has data on that they recently published. So that's wrong. The notion that that vaccines are the backbone of the pharmaceutical industry, I don't know what that writer is talking about. There are 4 companies that make vaccines essentially for Americans' children. The vaccine part of those companies is less than 10% of what they do for obvious reasons. Vaccines are given once or a few times in your lifetime. They're never going to compete with the drugs that you're taking every day, like lipid-lowering agents or diabetes drugs or psychiatric drugs, et cetera, neurological drugs. So they're always the weak sister in terms of revenue for those pharmaceutical companies. The notion that vaccines don't work is also fanciful. I mean, we've eliminated smallpox from the face of the earth because of vaccination. We've eliminated 2 of the 3 types of polio from the face of the earth because of vaccination. I mean, I had, and as did all my friends, had measles when I was growing up. Now we have pretty much fewer than 100 cases every year. So we've dramatically changed the landscape of the health in this country because of vaccination. We live 30 years longer than we did 100 years ago, in large part because of vaccination and antibiotics and sanitation, but vaccinations are a big part of that. So I don't know what they're talking about.
He seemed to have these doctors he could quote. So
I think you can get somebody to say anything. I think you can get a doctor or a scientist to say anything. I do. I mean, it's not a uniform group. Not everybody finishes at the top of their class. I just think you can get. I mean, the Flat Earth Society still has a website.
Comment one thing about the 145,000 deaths in the 20th century from vaccine.
I don't know
idea where that number.
What they're talking about.
Okay.
I mean, I think what they're probably talking about is in the late 1980s there was a program that was created in this country called the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, which included the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. It also included this so-called VAERS system, Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System. So anybody can report anything following a vaccine if they think that the vaccine caused it. So anybody, it's not in any way filtered out. Anything you can get a vaccine and then say that you turned into the Incredible Hulk, fill out a page form, and that will go into a database system that's co-directed by the FDA and the CDC. That's true. There's no filtering it out. So therefore, you can claim a death, even though a death really wasn't caused by the vaccine. And whenever these deaths are reported, the CDC invariably goes to see what really was the cause, and it invariably wasn't the vaccine. So I think this person is just looking on that database and saying, look at all these reported cases.
Okay, great. Thank you for clearing that up. Let's get off vaccines. Is that all right?
Sure.
I do have many questions about some of your other books. And for one thing, they're great writing. They read like fiction, and I mean that in a good way. They're engaging stories so that it's not a dry, technical book. I hope that doesn't insult anybody that writes dry technical books. But if you pick up one of your books, you have a story to tell there. And usually there's a personal story, and it also follows the medical portion of it. So I just have a couple quick questions about that, and actually I have 3, but the first 2 I'll ask right now. How do you choose a topic, and then how much research do you do? Because these books are deep.
Right, it depends. I mean, so how I choose it, just sort of whatever kind of hits me at the time. There's not any sort of master plan here. It depends on the nature of the subject. So I would say the book that took the most time was a book I wrote called The Cutter Incident, which was about a company, Cutter Laboratories, that was one of the first companies, one of the 5 original companies to make a polio vaccine, Jonas Salk's polio vaccine. So Jonas Salk took his virus, polio virus, grew it up, purified it, and then inactivated the virus with formaldehyde. One company that stepped forward to make that vaccine made it badly, and they failed to fully inactivate the virus. As a consequence, about 200,000 children were inadvertently inoculated with live, fully virulent polio virus. About 120,000 developed, or about 120,000 were inoculated. Sorry, about 40,000 developed short-lived polio, so-called abortive polio. About 200 were permanently paralyzed, and 10 were killed. I think it's honestly the worst biological disaster to happen in this country ever, and I just wanted to get at that. So it meant looking at a lot of archives. It meant looking at Cutter's archives. It meant looking at Jonas Salk's archives. It meant going through the records of what these companies had put out. It meant going through all the legal cases, and that was probably an 8-year effort in terms of research, and that was my favorite book. It remains my favorite book. But my favorite chapter in that book is what went wrong at Cutter Laboratories, because at the time I talked to senior scientists who said they were bad players, that they knew they had a problem. I found that very hard to believe, that they knew they had a problem and then sent that vaccine out knowing that it could cause a problem. Because first of all, the people who were in the manufacturing division vaccinated their own children with that vaccine, which argued to me that they didn't know they had a problem.
Okay.
And as you got those sort of interviews on the record, it became more and more clear what the problem really was at Cutter.
So they did not intentionally send out a live vaccine?
Of course not.
Okay, so the people that told you they did were incorrect.
And they were senior people. They were senior people that I trust. But I just couldn't believe it. And so it sort of propelled me to look closer.
And what year was that again? Not the book, The Cutter Incident.
1955.
1955. Your most recent book, though, is Bad Advice or Why Politicians, Celebrities Aren't Your Best Authority of
Source of health information.
Health information. And I wanted to ask you a question about that, because when I first picked up the book, I thought it was just going to be a flamethrower on celebrities that stand up and do rallies and things. But I actually found it a very positive book for how science works and what it does, when you could have just ripped these celebrities apart, I thought. So was that a conscious decision, or did the book just flow that way? Does my question make sense?
Yeah, the question makes sense. I think it's too easy, first of all. I mean, it's like making fun of the fat lady at the circus. I mean, that just seems cruel. No, it's more about, I think probably the more accurate title is sort of How to Communicate Science to the Public or Die Trying. I mean, it's sort of all this, how does one, here you have good information here, you have a populace that clearly wants good information, and how do you get from here to here without suffering this opaque window, which includes politicians and activists and celebrities and the media, and there's a variety of other things that cloud that window that doesn't let that good information go there, and that's the frustration, I guess, that drove me to write this book.
Well, talk a little bit about, so a celebrity is just a person like myself. I'm not scientifically trained. I rely on my doctor and hopefully good information I get via the internet, which is a source of information now. You can't not.
It's a source of good and awful information.
Right. As a lay person, science can come off a little wishy-washy, right? Because it's not, they avoid saying things like, we're sure this works or this is 100%. They kind of hedge their bets. In the public, we see reports that are 1 year this, 1 year that. So can you understand my confusion?
Yeah, so I think it's at a couple levels. One is that the scientific method allows you to form a hypothesis. So does MMR vaccine, measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, cause autism? The way you form the hypothesis in the scientific method is the so-called null hypothesis. MMR vaccine does not cause autism.
Okay, so we start there.
That's where you start. And then you can do two things with that. You can reject the null hypothesis, which is to say when you see autism following receipt of the MMR vaccine, it occurs at a level greater than would be expected by chance alone. Or you can not reject it, not reject the null hypothesis, which is to say when autism follows receipt of the vaccine, it occurs at a level that would be expected by chance alone. But you can never accept the null hypothesis. You can never prove never. And I think scientists always know that when they go on television or whatever. So they know they can't say, technically they can't say MMR doesn't cause autism. So what they do is it sounds like they're waffling or worse, covering something up because the language is always vaguer. So I think that's one aspect of what you're saying. I think the second aspect is we accumulate. What science isn't is it isn't scientists and it isn't scientific advisory bodies. I mean, it's not even textbooks, which we're willing to throw over our shoulder without a backward glance as we learn more and more. You learn as you go. I mean, there were things that I learned in my medical training that were dead wrong. I mean, when I was trained as a pediatrician, you were trained that the child should, when they had eaten, that they should sort of sleep on their front. And as it turns out, that actually increased your risk of sudden infant death syndrome. So the American Academy of Pediatrics started their back to sleep program, meaning sleep on your back, and it dramatically decreased the incidence of sudden infant death syndrome. So that doesn't mean that you can't trust science. It just means that science evolves over time, and you have to be conscious that that's the process. It's okay. Scientists get it wrong all the time. Science eventually gets it right.
So speak about the null hypothesis. You mentioned you can never reject it.
You can never accept it.
I'm sorry, golly. You can never accept it, but you kind of skipped over. At what point do you reject it? If you understand. After you get the null hypothesis, then you have to set up a series of experiments.
Right. So to reject, so the null hypothesis, MMR does not cause autism. To reject that, to say that that's wrong, you do a series of studies with children who got the MMR vaccine or who didn't get the MMR vaccine, epidemiological studies, and make sure that those two groups are alike in all other aspects, like healthcare-seeking behavior, socioeconomic background, medical background, so you can isolate the effect of that one variable, receipt of the vaccine. Does receiving the vaccine clearly, statistically, significantly increase your risk of autism? If you do study after study after study that shows that it does, then you can reject the null hypothesis.
And how long does it take to or design a study, or how many years, in a sense, to make sure you can eliminate that one variable? That's going to be kind of tricky, right?
But that's the challenge of doing epidemiological studies. You have to isolate the effect of that variable. So in this case, in this particular instance, there have been 17 studies that have been done in 7 different countries, on 3 different continents over the past 20 plus years. Showing that they're involving hundreds of thousands of children, costing tens of millions of dollars, that show that MMR vaccine doesn't cause autism. You're at no greater likelihood of getting autism if you got that vaccine or if you didn't. And that's okay. I mean, I think you could argue that when that paper was originally published, which was just a case series, it wasn't a study, that it raised the hypothesis, but it was a testable hypothesis. You can test that hypothesis. It's been tested again and again, and it was just wrong.
And speak back to the pharmaceutical industry question that is the backbone. You mentioned there are 4 pharmaceutical companies that make vaccinations now, but didn't it used to be a lot higher?
For America's children.
For America's children.
Yeah. So
what happened?
Well, in 1955,
Well,
there were 27 companies that made vaccines for America's children. By 1980, it was about 18 companies. Now it's 4. The main reason being it was a little bit of merger, but it was mostly dropout. I mean, vaccines are not a terribly lucrative business, is the bottom line. I mean, take something like Lipitor, which is a low-density lipoprotein cholesterol-lowering agent. That was probably when it went off patent, a $13 billion a year product as one of several lipid-lowering agents. I mean, that's probably the entire worldwide vaccine industry. It's just never going to be, because you take it once or a few times in your lifetime. So I think it's not worth it. The research and development costs for vaccines are high, not surprisingly. I mean, I was fortunate to work with a team at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia that developed the rotavirus vaccine, and we created the strains in our lab. But ultimately, that was a probably $1.2 billion research of development effort by the company that made that vaccine, and it's done at risk. And for a product that's not terribly lucrative for them, because it's just given once or a few times in your life and then you're done.
So what's are they funded by the government partly? I mean, so once you get that far, I remember reading in your book, you have to patent it or nobody will look at it, because so that's not an evil fact.
Technology has to be protected in order for the companies to advance it.
And so why, if it's not lucrative, what are they doing? Just goodwill of humankind here, or subsidized by the government, or?
I think there are some advantages to vaccines. There's generally only.
You mean for the pharmaceutical?
For the pharmaceutical companies. Once it's not. You don't have to invent a new biology usually. In other words, you can take a virus. If you use viruses as an example, you can take a virus and weaken it. You can take a virus and kill it. You can use recombinant DNA technology to take one part of the virus. I mean, that's sort of the standard ways one would make a viral vaccine. So it's not. You don't have to invent a new biology. The other thing is it's patent independent. Really, once vaccines are off patent, it's not like a bunch of generics come rushing in to fill the void, because the research and development costs for making vaccines is incredibly high. So it is patent independent in a sense, which is an advantage over typical pharmaceutical products.
More about bad advice and celebrities. So news magazine hosts, journalists, celebrities. Are they scientists? Do you think they're sincere? What do you think's going on there?
Well, I think.
And what I mean by that is the people that go against, I'd hate to say go against, it wouldn't be common knowledge, but go against what science and their doctors are telling them. They know they're on the fringe, right?
I can't get into their heads. I think that I think celebrities enjoy their celebrity. I think they enjoy the platform that celebrities give their celebrity gives them, and so they'll often comment on things, whether they're world events or U.S. events or health issues, and most of them really use that platform for the good. I mean, you look at somebody like Amanda Peet or Carrie Russell or Jennifer Lopez are all been very positive about vaccines. I mean, there's a picture of Elvis Presley right behind you. Elvis Presley, got the polio vaccine right on the national television. So I think I think most of them use their celebrity that way, but not all. And some of them, I think Jenny McCarthy really does believe that her child's autism was caused by vaccines, even though that wasn't true. And I think it's okay to have the notion, right? My child was fine. They got a vaccine. Now they're not fine. Could the vaccine have done it? Fair enough. It is an answerable question, though. I mean, you're not asking how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. This is an answerable question in a scientific venue, and it's been answered again and again. And that's where Jenny McCarthy loses me. She moves from skeptical, which is fair. I think you should be skeptical about anything you put into your body or your child's body, to cynical, which is to say she just thinks it's a vast conspiracy to hide the truth, and that's just wrong.
And there are also several medical shows that people watch during the day. And not only medical shows, but there are just hosted shows where they have medical advice come on, all kinds of crazy stuff. And people look to their, what do you call, daytime heroes, I guess I would call it, for advice in a way. And some of these are doctors, and they are contrary to, so I guess you'd call them celebrity doctors. So is that already a bad sign? If you see something that's celebrity doctor, is that already something to be cause for concern?
Well, I think to get on TV, to have a TV show where you have a significant numbers of advertising dollars to support your show, I think that's got to be dramatic. It's got to be amazing. And so I think Mehmet Oz, who I think does a number of good things on his show to sort of get you to think about things that are healthy, I think crosses that line into the magic medicine, the magic pill that makes your hair thicker, the magic pill that makes your sex better, the magic pill that makes your skin look better. I mean, I think Dr. Oz does a lot of good things on his show. I think he gets you to think about, exercise and meditation, and I think that's all great, the sort of wellness business. But when he offers you a magic pill to make your hair thicker, your sex better, your skin, more, have a better sheen, I think that's when he crosses a line into just kind of catering to a public that's desperate for magic pills.
The other odd thing is, I've never watched a week of his shows, but I've seen a couple of them as I scan by. And an interesting thing is, if you kind of summed up what he talks about, you would have a medicine chest and a pantry full of all these things you had to do all the time.
Supplements, primarily, dietary supplements.
Supplements, but you'd also think that, just the crazy things that they fix are, I don't know if they need fixing, so to speak.
Right.
Well, let's go back to science from the Bad Advice book, and I'm going to read this quote that I wrote to myself, actually. So you write about the 4 pillars of science. So peer review, critical thinking, reproducibility, and plausibility. And what about press release? It's kind of strangely absent there, but it seems to be used quite frequently.
Meaning that?
Well, sometimes you see a press release, and let me talk a little bit. I remember when cold fusion came about. It was like a thrill for me because I was quite young. I was like, oh my gosh, the world's going to change, right? The genetic, learning how your own DNA is made up so you can get a specific genetic pill to take if you get cancer was like, oh my gosh, that's terribly exciting. And those things have not only faded away, but they've kind of taken a deep dive. So those were press releases, but there wasn't research to back them up. So if you see a press release before there's research, plausibility, and peer review, is that a bad sign right away?
I think of those
Does
pillars,
that question make sense?
It does. I would say, though, of the pillars that you listed, the one that is the most important, far and away, is reproducibility. So there was, they use cold fusion as an example. I mean, here were 2 chemists. I mean, one was an assistant professor, the other was a professor emeritus of chemistry, both at the University of Utah. And what they did was they took sort of a palladium wire, they attached it to a battery, they put it into heavy water, so-called deuterium, and they claimed that 2 smaller nuclei could fuse to form a larger nucleus, which would then release energy, which is what happens on the surface of the sun to create energy. The difference is that instead of doing it on the surface of the sun where it's a lot hotter, they did it just at room temperature, so-called cold fusion. Now, It violated the first law of thermodynamics, which is to say that you really can't get more energy out of something you put into it. That should have bothered people a lot more than it did, and not shockingly, that was never reproduced. There's a book by Gary Taubes called Bad Science, which goes through that story, how 75 research groups tried to reproduce that unsuccessfully, and that's where it all failed. And see, but I think that's why you can trust science. Now, was there a press release? Absolutely. The University of Utah loved this. They gave, in fact, the university got the state to give $5 million to create the National Cold Fusion Research Institute, which still stands on the University of Utah's campus. It's not called that anymore, but it's a literal monument to bad science.
It got that far, though.
That's because we wanted it. I mean, it was.
No, but wait a minute. Once they got the $5 million, these two people came out with the press release or whatever, but within that department, there had to be a dozen other chemists and any kind of a physicist that would say, wait a minute, you guys are crazy. What do you have a press release for getting $5 million? This is perpetual motion baloney. I was going to say it's baloney, and most scientists across the world would know it. Yet it got that far through the process.
Right, and the perpetual motion machine is a perfect example, because that's another example of you can't get more energy out of something you put into it, which is why there'll never be a perpetual motion machine. But you're right. I think it was 1989. It was right around the time of the Exxon Valdez disaster, and we wanted to believe there was this clean, limitless sort of price-free source of energy, and even though that wasn't true. And even mainstream excellent science writers, I remember one for the Wall Street Journal, wrote about this as if it was fact, and it clearly couldn't have been fact.
That brings me to a follow-up question. What about journalists and science writers and TV production crews and the producers? Because they work behind the scenes. By the time you get to the host, there's a lot of people you've gone through. Not you specifically, but if they're bringing on some guest that has one of these great ideas that's going to change the world, it goes all the way through those steps. What have you found regarding producers and production crews and science writers that are supposed to kind of be, well, I would think that there'd be somebody to say, we don't want this guest because he's just crazy.
Yeah, I mean, the fact is that their research was published. That cold fusion research was published by Pons and Fleischmann. And similarly, the notion of MMR as a cause of autism was published in The Lancet. Now, I mean, and to protect, I guess to stand up for the media here to some extent, okay. I think the media assumes that if this is published in The Lancet, as that paper was, Wakefield's paper was, that there had to be some vetting. That aren't there reviewers that review the paper that then decide that it should be published? And the answer was, of the 6 reviewers that reviewed that paper, 4 said it should be rejected, and 2 said it should be published with significant changes. But the editor-in-chief of that journal at the time, Richard Horton, was friends with Andrew Wakefield, and he thought, well, let's just run it up the flagpole and see if there's anything to this MMR causing autism business, which was at least naive, because look at what the fallout of all that was. And obviously it wasn't reproduced. But from the media standpoint, should we wait? Should we wait another 5 or 10 years to see whether or not other studies reproduce that or not? But then this happens all the time. It's the single study trap. You get trapped by that single study.
So you kind of have a little bit of sympathy for the media and the producers and the production crews and the science writers, and they just have to get their, not scoop so much, but they have to stay on top of the times?
Yeah, I guess I wish they'd be a little more circumspect, though. Instead of putting this forward as like an amazing, important discovery, they should put it forward and say, this question has been raised. There are some questions about the biological plausibility, or in the case of sort of the hard sciences, the physical plausibility of all this, and let's wait to see before we jump all over this. Let's wait. So when the Wakefield paper came out in The Lancet, I mean, what he proposed was a series of impossible events. He said, here's the problem. Because you've taken this combination, this measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, and combined it, you've overwhelmed the immune system. That's step one, right? Well, this was 1998. You could do skin tests, you could do serological tests to see whether the immune system was blunted. Never done. Then, because your immune system was overwhelmed, that allowed measles vaccine virus to go to the intestine, reproduce itself at the intestinal mucosal surface, and damage the intestine. Well, he biopsied every one of those children, and so he could have easily looked into those biopsy samples and see, was there measles vaccine virus genome there? Were there measles vaccine virus proteins there? In the paper, he said he was going to be doing that. Well, you have the biopsy material. I mean, it's there or it's not. How can you not do that before you publish this paper? Then, because the intestine was damaged, that allowed for the entrance of as yet unidentified brain-damaging proteins that entered the circulation, traveled to the brain, crossed an intact blood-brain barrier, and caused autism. Well, you had serum from all those children. You had serum from control children that Dr. Wakefield had obtained from his son's birthday party, which was part of his problem.
Unethically, right?
Yeah, unethically, I think. And so compare it. He brought up things, maybe it's gluten, maybe it's casein. Well, look at those. You can look at that. He never did any of that. He just proposed a series of events by having no evidence behind it. And as Carl Sagan says, that extraordinary claims should be backed up by extraordinary evidence. This was an extraordinary claim that was backed up by no evidence. Now, I don't expect the journalists necessarily to pick that up, but doctors certainly picked that up. Scientists certainly picked that up. We picked that up at the time. Here's the problems with that. So at least put that out there instead of, I think we have found a cause of autism, which obviously wasn't true for so many reasons. It's not always just it was true. It never made sense it would have been true.
There's the plausibility part then.
Right.
It wasn't plausible.
Right.
Like the cold fusion. The headline should have been, two chemists learn how to violate the laws of thermodynamics. That's a headline, right?
Let's throw out the first law of thermodynamics.
But then
that could have been instructive and fun.
But then people might have paid more attention, I suppose, because at least most people should know that you can't violate that law. So let's move on to Pandora's box.
Pandora's lab.
Pandora's lab. Pandora's box is the Greek myth, right?
Right.
So Pandora's lab, another great book, 7 Stories of Science Gone Wrong. Mm-hmm. And let me just ask one little question about this. So margarine, eugenics, Rachel Carson, and Linus Pauling. Where did they go wrong? I mean, they all have one thing in common. Can you tell me what happened here?
Yeah, they had a notion of the way that things worked, and it ended up being dead wrong. I mean, Linus Pauling's a perfect example, and gets back to sort of something we were talking about earlier. So there's a great scientist. He understood basically the structure of proteins, the alpha helix structure of proteins. I mean, that for which he won the Nobel Prize. I mean, we knew sort of what proteins, what amino acids made up proteins. We knew the 20 amino acids and how they were arranged. We just didn't understand how it all fit together. I mean, how what the molecule actually looked like. That was his advance, for which he won the Nobel Prize. And then he, for his anti-war activity, won the Nobel Peace Prize. 2 Nobel Prizes, not bad. It's not like they're giving these things out in cracker jack boxes. That's pretty good. So, and then something happened to him in his mid-60s, when he was in his mid-60s, where he sort of lost his mind. He just, instead of being such a rigorous, devoted scientist, which he was, meaning, sort of built on data after data after data.
Yeah, he knew how science worked.
Yeah, he just had a belief system. His belief was that high doses of vitamin C could not only treat or prevent colds, but could treat cancer. And even though studies started to show clearly that hypothesis was wrong, he refused to believe it. Something happened to him, or I guess he had fought the fight so long on his alpha helix structure, which, people didn't believe it initially, and then he eventually proved that. He believed that therefore anything that he believed had to be true, even if others thought that he was wrong. Something happened. I don't know what, but this happens. I mean, Peter Duesberg was an excellent retrovirologist, meaning like HIV, human immunodeficiency virus virologist, and he was an AIDS denier for a while, meaning he didn't believe that HIV caused AIDS, even though he was a brilliant virologist. Or Luc Montagnier, who won the Nobel Prize for discovering HIV as was the cause of AIDS, now has set up a clinic in Japan believing that, giving antibiotics can treat autism. So what happens? I don't know. I mean, as I get older, maybe I shouldn't be so critical of people, because this could happen to me too. I'm choosing to believe it's not going to happen to me, but even the most brilliant minds can be led astray.
And I'm not quite sure how to say this, but I recall from the book, he had not an army, but he had several people working with him. And when their results didn't turn up the evidence that he wanted, he kind of went off the deep end with them. He would fire them.
That's right. Arthur Robinson, that's right. He fired Arthur Robinson. He was like his chief scientific officer.
Was he just like, you all are against me in a way?
Yeah,
or
maybe
did you get into it that far?
I don't know his psychology, but he lost it. I mean, it was, but the question, where did our notion that vitamin C could treat or prevent a cold come from, was Linus Pauling. I mean, it's called the Pauling effect.
He fired the person that found evidence not to support him, so that kind of just builds into a bias in testing. He just wanted to find out that he only wanted positive results. And you're saying that just comes from being told you're so smart all the time? I guess you can't probably.
I don't know his psychology. It was sad to watch.
Sad to watch.
And I'm sure for his colleagues was much sadder.
Margarine and eugenics two totally separate things. But let's deal with eugenics, actually. Because there's something that I've known is false, and it was interesting to read about it in your book, but I don't quite understand it. So maybe you can explain it a little bit more, because, you know, we can crossbreed animals to get exactly what we want. So what's wrong with the philosophy? And I don't want to offend anybody or get into a let's sterilize the mentally deficient or anything, but where does it fail in humanity that you can't crossbreed people to get exactly what you want?
No, I think so Mendelian genetics teaches us that you know, that you can breed corn in a certain manner that causes it to be highly productive, or a variety of plants, and that you can breed animals to be faster racehorses. You can breed cows to be better milk producers,
or dogs to be friendlier,
dogs to be friendlier, or dogs to be faster if you're racing dogs, whatever. I mean, so you can breed all of that. It's true. So physical characteristics can be bred. Where eugenics crosses the line is a belief that character is also determined by that, so that you can actually characterize certain ethnic backgrounds or religious backgrounds or countries of origin as being of a certain character. I mean, when Donald Trump says, you know, when the Mexicans come up, you know, they're not setting their best, they're rapists, they're murderers, he's vaguely alluding to sort of this eugenics notion that you can characterize a group of people by where they are living as to what their character is. And that's where you cross an important line. Obviously, I think eugenics reached its logical end in Hitler's Germany, where, you know, he believed that Jews were an inferior race and must be eliminated. That's eugenics at its illogical end.
Well, yeah, then it's going into, okay, I understand that part of it. So theoretically, is it possible to pick two smart, tall people and make better Olympians? Well, it seems like there are too many variables in humanity that it's a crapshoot no matter who you, right? Well, only because I say that because, you know, I'm a trained musician. Neither of my parents play music. Doesn't mean if I had a kid they'd be musically inclined. Right. I mean, there are a lot. That's not just characters. There's so much going on. Are humans just more complicated, or?
Yes.
Okay. So you can't just breed tall, fast Olympians. You got to.
Well, so there was positive eugenics, which is to say that you tried to encourage people who were better, faster, stronger, smarter to intermarry in that way, that you would breed a better population of people. You
encourage them.
But it's you know, look at all the wonderful people that come out of the most dire circumstances. You know, that teaches you that, you know, we're an outbred population and anything can happen.
Let's talk about margarine. I think margarine was just an alternative to butter because it was cheaper, but then it was also thought to be, is that correct? When it first came out, it was in the 40s because of World War II?
That's right, initially, that's right.
We thought it was cheaper.
Oleo.
And then it was also supposed to be more healthy. So my house was filled with margarine as a child, and then here it is, 2018, and oh my gosh, margarine's the worst thing in the world you could ever have done. So what's going on?
And that is true. I think it actually is the worst thing in the world you ever could have done, in the sense that
how can it go so wrong?
So here's what happened. There was a nutritionist named Ansel Keys, who was in the mid-1950s an advisor to the World Health Organization, an advisor to the United Nations. He was a well-respected nutritionist. It was his belief that saturated fats were bad and unsaturated fats were good. Animal fat, like butter, for example, contains, you know, fairly large quantities of saturated fats. Therefore, butter became evil. So he argued, let's take partially hydrogenated vegetable oils like margarine, and this has a much greater quantity of unsaturated fats, which we now know contained large quantities of trans fats, which was probably the most dangerous macromolecule we've ever used in this country. And once we used it under the category of, as he called it, the heart-healthy diet, we probably were causing 250,000 cardiovascular-related deaths a year, until we finally now got trans fats pretty much out of our diet. But it took us a while to figure that out. And again, I think, you know, people say, see, that's why you can't trust science. But again, that's why you can trust science, because we did eventually figure it out. But, you know, knowledge always comes with a certain price, and sometimes it's a human price. It's always true. That's always been true. It always will be true.
So it was a thoughtful step forward in a way. But can you speak about? But it wasn't, obviously. It was a huge disaster. But we know that because of science. But was one of the basic mistakes? I'm not sure about metabolism. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a scientist. But it kind of makes sense to a person that, saturated fat, a coronary artery disease, it's fat. So there's a one-to-one thing there. Get rid of the saturated fat, we'll get rid of coronary artery disease. But apparently I've made a huge blunder in this, this step of one thing automatically equals another. So how does that how do you figure out that's not so? And do you understand my blunder?
Yeah, no, I do. So there are certain things that are true. I mean, low-density lipoprotein, especially cholesterol, low-density lipoprotein cholesterol, so-called bad cholesterol, and the so-called very low-density lipoprotein cholesterol is very bad cholesterol, is bad for you. There's a direct correlation between that and the plaques that form in your coronary arteries, so-called heart arteries that supply the muscle of your heart. And high-density lipoprotein, on the other hand, is good cholesterol, right? So there's that knowledge, and the thinking was, oh, great, avoid cholesterol. Just don't eat cholesterol. Don't, this is your best bet. And so, eggs became, evil for a while there, but that wasn't that simple, because most of your cholesterol is just made in your body anyway. It's really not so much as you take it in.
Okay, so let's step that back. So just say, oh, high cholesterol bad, let's just avoid cholesterol. Makes sense, right?
Well, low cholesterol is bad, but yes.
Okay, so it makes sense.
But see, and the same thing you could say for when you eat, when your body converts food into energy, the process that it uses to do that is oxidation. That's what it does. Oxidation creates free radicals. Free radicals damage cell membranes. Free radicals damage DNA. It's true. Oxidation, I think the minute we flip on the switch of life, we have started to sow the seeds of our own destruction, because oxidation affects those things. And so now your body also makes some natural antioxidants, like glutathione. There are natural antioxidants. And so let's take a step about how looking at people who ingest quantities of antioxidants. And so antioxidants are in vegetables, they're in fruits. If you look at populations that ingest more antioxidants in their food, they tend to have less cancer, less heart disease, and live longer. So the thing was, great, okay, if that's true, then let's take supplemental antioxidants.
Makes sense.
Yeah, which made sense, except what now study after study has shown that if you take large quantities of supplemental antioxidants, you increase your rate of heart disease and increase your rate of cancer, because oxidation also does other things. You need, when you have a bacteria, for example, that enters your body, in order to kill that bacteria, your body uses oxidation. Your body also uses oxidation to kill new cancer cells. It also uses oxidation to help clear clogged arteries. So you can get too much of a good thing. You know what I'm saying? So the logic of that went one step too far. It's, and that's, you learn as you go.
Interestingly, in Pandora's Lab, you took on, well, I shouldn't say you took on, but you wrote about Rachel Carson. Now, she's kind of a mythical hero.
Which explains all the hate mail I got, I guess, after I wrote that book, yeah.
Well, I'm familiar with the story a little bit, in that, she kind of, much more so now based on what you wrote, but go ahead and explain that a little bit. And how did that end up in your book?
So Rachel Carson is a hero. I mean, a hero in the sense that she was really one of the first to stand up and say, what we're doing as humans is affecting our environment and therefore affecting our health. That was great, and she was brave and she was straightforward. What I objected to in this book is that she claimed that DDT, in her book Silent Spring, caused things that it didn't cause. She claimed that it caused breast cancer. She claimed that it caused leukemia in children. She claimed that it caused sudden infant deaths in children. She was a powerful writer. She had a big platform, and those claims weren't right. As a consequence, we eliminated DDT in the United States and ultimately use of DDT in the world. DDT did have some public health advantages regarding eliminating the mosquitoes that carry malaria, which is an infectious disease, is the world's biggest killer. And so when we eliminated DDT, then we put those children in countries where malaria was prevalent at greater risk. And now, DDT has been put back into these programs again, starting in 2006. So it took us decades to get past that Silent Spring call. But she did important things. She just overstepped it on DDT. It did have, using it in agriculture wasn't not necessary, but using it in public health did have advantages, and she eliminated that.
So you got hate mail from that. Interesting.
Oh yeah, no, I think you can't criticize Rachel Carson.
That's
including
odd.
People at this group today. I mean, they really, it's sort of like you have to buy into the whole menu.
Oh, okay. Well, that's interesting. That's an interesting commentary. Can you speak briefly about chronic Lyme disease? And I know there was a vaccine in the work years ago. It's gone now. Lyme disease is all the way through the United States now. It's in part of Europe, but there's a real disease there with a few stages. And somehow from this real disease, it's become an alternative disease of chronic. So can you define the three stages and what actually late stage Lyme disease is and why it's not chronic Lyme disease?
Right, so Lyme is caused by bacteria, Borrelia burgdorferi, which is injected into your bloodstream by the bite of a tick. Sometimes you'll get the so-called bullseye rash at the site of the inoculation of the bacteria by the tick. Sometimes the bullseye rash can appear in other parts of your body. You can have flu-like symptoms. You can have, even in the earlier stages, you can have the bacteria can travel to the lining of the brain and spinal cord and cause meningitis, and it can cause arthritis, inflammation of the joints. What can happen later is that you can get this either a chronic or persistent arthritis that was caused by
Before you go on
Lyme.
later, though, you can work through those stages and be fine, right? Your body.
Oh yeah, no, usually you are. Really, the main reason that you treat Lyme infection with antibiotics is to prevent chronic or persistent arthritis. I mean, the disease is self-limited.
It is self-limited.
Untreated is self-limited.
Untreated, it's self-limited.
Yes, untreated is self-limited, but you're at greater risk of having chronic or persistent arthritis if you don't treat it.
Okay,
Hence
so
the treatment. That's why we treat it.
Okay, so now go on from where I stopped you.
Okay, so, and then there's a reason for that sort of chronic or persistent disease, but that's why we treat it. Now that's Lyme disease, and so there is a chronic component to actual Lyme disease, which is that chronic or persistent arthritis, and sometimes it can also affect the heart, causing carditis and heart block, which can be dangerous, which is another sort of long-term manifestation of Lyme disease. But then there's this other thing that people talk about when they say chronic Lyme disease. They're talking about things like chronic pain syndromes or chronic fatigue syndromes, and that's and therefore they feel that they should be on antibiotics instead of being on it for the 4 to 6 weeks as originally recommended, that they could be on it for months or years, and that's nonsense.
So I want to go back to one of your previous books and sum up here because I had a couple of questions about it. Bad faith. And this goes back to the research question. Those are incredibly personal stories, many involving children that died, that could have been, they died from treatable and preventable diseases. And we spoke briefly about the research, but let's talk about, is Joey Hofbauer, was it, that was
Joey Hofbauer.
Was that in Bad Faith?
That was actually in this book.
Okay, sorry. So let's talk about I can use it anyway, because that's a devastating story. His parents fell for some kind of huckster, pseudoscientific lymphoma cure. Not only did they fall for it, but they convinced the state, and at multiple stops it should have been denied and treatment given. And I think at the end his doctor even said, oh, it's good that his neck is bulging with these things because it means the cancer's working. I mean, it's just the most bizarre thing. And so the question I have for you is, when you did that research, it's very personal. How do you, as a person, not as a writer, as a scientist, how do you relate to what's going on there? I mean, I just felt so bad for the kid and the circumstances. How do you write about it?
Well, I mean, so I'm a pediatrician at heart. I mean, I'm trained in pediatrics and then do now pediatric infectious diseases and basic science. But I mean, I've always seen myself as a child advocate. I think actually all my books at some level are about child advocacy. So here, when children in the book like Bad Faith aren't being given insulin for their diabetes, aren't being given antibiotics for their meningitis or their pneumonia, aren't being given life-saving cancer chemotherapies because their parents say that this is just not my religious belief. I mean, at the heart of this, I think while you are at liberty to martyr yourself to your religion, you should not be at liberty to martyr your child to your religion. And unfortunately, the laws in this country haven't caught up to that notion yet, and it's just unconscionable. And so these stories, as painful as they were, still, I think, make that point. That was the point of this book.
Yeah, they are painful. And let me specifically zoom in on Bad Faith now. When you did that research, you wrote in the foreword, I think, that you expected it not to bring you closer to religion, but it brought you actually closer. Can you comment on that? Because when I read the book, again, devastating stories, and how did it bring you closer to?
Well, so when there were those measles outbreaks in Philadelphia, and parents were choosing not to have medical care. These faith-healing parents chose not to have medical care. So when their children got dehydrated, they wouldn't let us take care of their child in the hospital to give them intravenous fluids that could save their life. Or when they had viral pneumonia from measles, they wouldn't let us, take the child and give them the oxygen that could save their lives. We eventually got to the point where we got a series of court orders that forced those parents to
define we just.
I'm sorry, we being the public health and academic community in Philadelphia, got to the point where we were able to get a series of laws passed where we could hospitalize those children against their parents' will. I talked to those parents and asked them, how could you do this? I mean, because as a parent, that's your number one job, is to keep your child safe. How can you stand back and watch your child suffer like that? And they all said the same thing. Jesus was our doctor. So with that, although I'm not a religious person, I thought, let me read the New Testament. Let me see on what basis did they make that claim. And so I sort of read through the New Testament and sort of putting Jesus in historical context with, books like A Zealot, the Rasan Azam's book. It helped me put Jesus in some historical. Jesus was a person. Jesus did live between roughly 4 BC to 30 AD, and he, at the time, child abuse was the crying vice of the Roman Empire. So you can do anything you wanted to children. Hippocrates never mentioned children. The children didn't matter, but they did to him. I mean, suffer me the children, for the kingdom of heaven is yours. He believed children had souls. He believed they could go to heaven. Verily I say unto you, as much as you have done it unto one of the least of my brethren, you have done it unto me. I came away with the opposite of what these parents had come away with. Jesus cared about children. I can't imagine that were he alive today, he would look at what these parents were doing and saying, okay, believe in me, but don't go to these doctors. And so I went to at the time, we all did, I went to the guy who was a major voice in religion in our city at the time, a guy named Anthony Bevilacqua, who'd just been elevated from bishop to cardinal. He was an important voice in our city, and we said, say something. Say this isn't us. Say these are not Christian acts. And he wouldn't do it. And it just really, really upset me, and I think in many ways was the impetus for writing the book, because I came to believe that religion teaches you to care about your children, care about your family, care about your community. And the difference, I guess I draw a distinction between religion and organized religion, because once men get involved in organizing religion, they screw it up.
Well, and also this title makes a little bit more sense now too, because that is bad faith. They put all of their faith in the supernatural. We'll fix it. Not to take advantage of what's going on now and that, they've learned. And
right. The implication being there's good faith. That's what I meant by that book, although some people took that title wrong. But I think there are those two things.
All righty. Dr. Paul Offit, thank you very much for being on 502 Conversations. I'm Brian Kirby. This is 502 Conversations. You can see more at 502conversations.com, and you can easily find Dr. Paul Offit on the web and at amazon.com. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're welcome.